I'm Representative Gail Griffin. I'm the co-chair for the committee. And
I'm Jamie Kelly, the other co-chair.
And Jamie's from
Mojave County Water Authority.
Thank you. Just for the record, those of you that want to speak, please push your button. When you're finished speaking, please turn it off. And keep in mind that everything we say is recorded, whether it's meant to be or not. Those in the audience, your conversations can be picked up as well. So just for disclosure purposes, this meeting is called to order. We have an agenda that Jamie and I have put together. I'm sure will be discussions on it. We have several handouts, and I think maybe if it's okay with everybody, I'll explain the handouts that I gave. The handouts from the department is the strategic vision planning area, so that we know what that is. I usually, if possible, put things on colored paper so you don't lose them. But the accomplishments for Arizona Water is on the orange. We updated that this past session and are looking at continuing the good work that Arizona has done for water management. Also in the handout is information on the Natural Resource Conservation District. There's a map. For those that are not aware, every inch of Arizona is covered by an NRCD, and there's also a trifold flyer that is included in the handout. The red and white map is a little bit different than what I usually hand out. The red and white maps that you usually see from me is the national map, but this one is just of Arizona. What you see in white is all we have in private hands, private ownership. Everything else is either Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest, state trust lands, military reservations, or tribal lands. If they don't qualify under one of those 5 categories, it's thrown into the private property category. Some of that private property is taxable, some of it is not taxable. But there was a study that was done in 1998 that showed that Arizona has 13% of land in private hands. So the other handouts are for my county, and just an example of what Cochise County is doing and the city of Sierra Vista is doing for water conservation. So those are the handouts that I brought for your consideration to review, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any of them. With that, Jamie, you want to cover the goals that we discussed? And
as reflected on the agenda, we set 3 goals, understanding that we needed a starting place, but that the committee may have some input into it. The first goal is to achieve a baseline understanding of Arizona groundwater in non-active management areas. We believe that the DWR has information on this and will be able to do a presentation to the committee by groundwater basin status in the planning areas using already existing data. We will not be looking at anything along the main stem of the Colorado. We are just non-AMA groundwater. The second goal is Goal B is to identify and develop voluntary alternatives to address groundwater issues by planning area while protecting individual property rights. In all of the committees I've sat on in the past year, Arizona seems to be very concerned that it be voluntary. Goal C is to make recommendations to the full council on best management practices at the local level. And would now be the time to read. As the committee, we have received a communication from a council member who is on the subcommittee, but I need to stop. Did we identify the people on the phone? Do we need to do around the room introductions before we go on?
Yeah, it probably would be good to do so that those that are listening in know who is here. And since it's being recorded, why don't we start over, if that's okay, with Wade to introduce everybody at the table.
Wade Noble, Yuma County Agriculture Water Coalition.
Pat Graham, the Nature Conservancy.
Chris Udall, Agribusiness Water Council of Arizona.
Tom Farley, Arizona Association of Realtors. Arizona Coalition, Mojave County Water Authority.
Chuck Podolak for SRP along with Dave Roberts.
Bill Garfield, Arizona Water Company.
I'm Brad Hill, the City of Flagstaff.
Kim Mitchell, Western Resource Advocates and part of Water for Arizona Coalition.
Chris Custis, EDF and Water for Arizona Coalition.
I'm Holly Irwin, La Paz County Board of Supervisors, District 3.
Pam Muse, designee for Lisa Atkins, Commissioner, Arizona State Land Department.
Stephanie Smallhouse, Arizona Farm Bureau.
Oh, here it is.
Bass Baja, Arizona Cattle Feeders.
Rob Anderson, Fenimore Craig, sitting in for Spencer Camps, the Home Builders Association.
Don Bills, Coconino Plateau Water Advisory Council and Water Partnership.
Rod Doba, Northern Arizona Municipal Water Users Association.
Doug Dunham, for Water.
All here.
Sandy Favorites, Freeport.
Gail Griffin, District 14, but I'm here as a designee for Russell Bowers, Speaker of the House.
Jamie Kelly, Mojave County Water Authority.
Clay Chandler with 80.
Senator Lisa Otondo, Legislative District 4.
And how do we identify those on the telephone?
Very slowly, one at a time, please.
This is
Those
Kathy
of you
Ferris.
on the phone, go ahead.
This is Kathy Ferris.
This is Jen Miles, Mayor, City of Kingman.
This is Alex Corcoran from Montgomery, an interpreter.
Sina Kerr, State Senator, LD 13.
Crystal Thule Cordova, Navajo Nation Water Management Branch.
Is there anyone else on the phone that has not identified themselves?
And keep in mind, those that are on the phone, we can hear your side conversations as well as when you want to be recognized. Thank you.
So you may wish to mute. Okay, back to the goals. I've read the A, B, and C. You have them on the agenda. I think now would be a time to read an email that Karen Modesto, the coordinator from DWR, received from Kathy Ferris. It reads, "Hi, Karen. I have reviewed the agenda for the upcoming meeting of the non-AMA Groundwater Committee and write to express some concerns. First, it appears from the agenda that the goals and objectives of the committee have already been set. As a member of the council and the committee, I believe the full committee should have the opportunity to discuss and formulate the committee's goals and objectives. Second, I do not agree with goals B and C. The committee should be free to discuss all possible measures to address groundwater issues, not just voluntary ones, which have, to date, been unsuccessful. Additionally, I do not understand the language about protecting individual property rights. The Arizona Supreme Court has determined that groundwater in Arizona belongs to the public and that its use may be regulated for the public good. I also believe the committee may want to make recommendations to the full council on matters other than best management practices at the local level. Third, the committee should have a far-ranging discussion on potential topics for consideration, not just those listed on the agenda. Any committee member should be able to propose items for discussion, and nothing at this point should be off the table. As I will not be able to attend the meeting in person, I would appreciate it if you would distribute copies of this email at the meeting. Thank you, Kathy. And I believe that copies of this email have been placed on the table as you enter if you wish to pick one up as you leave. With that being said and the goals being read, do we have comments from any other committee members on A, B, or C?
Madam Co-Chair.
Yes.
Ron Doba with NAMWA. I would just like to indicate that I think Kathy makes some good points here. I also noticed the voluntary alternatives, and I understand why we have the voluntary alternatives on there, but that may not work in all cases. And I think that we should look at maybe some that are not voluntary as well, if it's necessary. And also with the last item that Kathy mentioned, there are other issues regarding groundwater that I think we may want to look at that are important to some of the folks in other parts of the state. Some examples would be our adequate water supply rules for areas outside of AMAs. There's some work going on for that right now. And another issue of concern in the northern part of the state is fracking. I'm not an expert on fracking by any means, but there's some issues going on regarding helium extraction up there and concerns about contamination of aquifers. So those are just some examples of some other areas that we may want to look at a little closer when we're looking at groundwater outside of active management areas.
Sandy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree also that while Kathy's made some good points, I think we need to be very careful about how far-reaching we make this. We want something that's going to be successful, that's actually going to be able to get through instead of, we can develop a lot of things that while they may sound good, they may actually work, but they will never get to implementation because of various obstacles. I think we do have to recognize some of those obstacles. We have to appreciate that people are very sensitive, particularly outside the active management areas, about their groundwater use, their availability, or the availability of groundwater, and the sensitivities around those issues. I do think that the private property issue is something, and I agree that the Supreme Court dealt with that as it relates to active management areas in the passage of the Groundwater Management Act. I think outside the AMAs, there's a different perspective, and we may or may not be able to tackle that here, but at least we can identify some available resources, some available practices, and things that will actually work in those areas, recognizing all the good work that has actually already been implemented outside the AMAs. I think learning from that, learning from the AMAs, there is a strategy for making mandatory conservation outside of AMAs, and that's by creating an AMA. So there's already a structure in place to address that, and I think that is the mechanism that is already there. So.
Good comments. Anybody else? Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On behalf of Mojave County, the Water for Arizona Coalition, we do agree with actually both speakers that all options really do need to be on the table. What works in some basins may not work in others. What could be voluntary in some basins may not work in others. We may need some regulation regarding monitoring just so we have some hard data so that some of these counties, particularly Mojave County, knows what they're dealing with so they can make good policy going forward. But again, recognize the sensitivity of both property rights and what works in other basins and other counties. It may not all be the same. So we don't object to looking at any kind of patchwork approach or any kind of approach, but as long as we can get everything out there for discussion to start and then see where we want to go from there.
Anybody else? The Wilcox area. Oh, Senator.
Thank you. I think it's imperative
that we try to conquer some of the more difficult areas. You know, the Supreme Court decision was the Supreme Court decision. We're here because this is the group of people in the know, people who have the legal and the legal expertise as well as the experience in water. Things may not pass through the legislature, but that doesn't mean that we can't bring up the really tough issues. We try to get done what we can get done. But the times are coming where not everybody is going to be happy with the future of groundwater in Arizona. And the conversation needs to begin now. And I truly believe that this is the place that it should begin. Where we begin to move, as far as the legislature is concerned, is going to really depend on the profile of the legislature. But that doesn't mean that we can't begin to prepare for the future. Arizona's water situation is in a crisis, and our groundwater is in a crisis. And I agree with you that not every basin can be treated the same, but we need to tackle some very, very difficult issues, and I think this is a good group to begin those discussions.
Stephanie?
Well, just a couple of comments. I would have to...
Let's introduce ourselves and who we're affiliated with for those that are listening in.
Stephanie Smallhouse, Arizona Farm Bureau. With respect to Senator Otondo, I guess I wouldn't agree that Arizona is in a water crisis. I think there are specific areas of Arizona that have some serious issues, and I think we're going to be looking at those issues in some areas that, honestly, I think some of those issues are maybe being overinflated to scare people into jumping into regulation. But so I think part of the major discussion in this group needs to be discerning where we have a crisis and where we are jumping the gun and looking at answers that are not necessary. One size does not fit all. I think for the property rights issue, since there's some confusion there, since we're mainly looking at areas outside of AMAs, which would be rural areas, most of these rural areas are highly dependent economically upon the use of groundwater, whether that's for industrial use or agriculture. And if it's deemed that regulation of that groundwater makes it makes a business unable to stay in business depending upon what happens, I think we need to remember that where the AMAs currently exist, there are alternative water sources. You know, we can't ignore that the CAP was a big reason why a lot of those groundwater users were able to switch, and there are a lot of areas of rural Arizona that have no alternative. So in terms of property rights, if there's no water available for the land that you have, specifically for resource users who are in production, then your rights have basically been taken away because you have very few alternatives of what to do with that property. And if we're going to open this up to tons of issues, you know, what about the adjudication? I mean, there are a lot of groundwater users that are sucked into the adjudication right now with subflow issues that don't even know which water is available and which isn't. So are we going to start writing plans over a third or more than that of Arizona that's currently involved in the adjudication and subflow issues? And should we be looking at solutions for all of those users? So just my comments.
Thank you.
Yes,
Mr. Hill.
So Brad Hill with the City of Flagstaff. So we would support expanding the goals to allow us to look at alternatives, and specifically how it relates to northern Arizona and the Coconino Aquifer that I thought this group would be interested in weighing in on. And that is some of the challenges that the city has had with the current rules relative to water adequacy outside of an AMA. The hydrologically, they don't make sense, and we all understand that, and the department's been very supportive. But there's also been some other challenges that have arisen over since the last 2 years that I thought would be if this group is interested, to at least hear what those are and then consider whether we want to move those forward. And it's all about how does Northern Arizona self-govern, and allow us, if we are interested in self-governing, to remove the legislative impediments existing today to allow that to occur. And so those would be just things that I would put on the table from my perspective.
Anyone else? Jamie?
Yes, thank you, Madam Co-Chair. I'm relatively new to these rooms and these types of meetings. I've only been participating for about a year. I would be inclined to open the discussion up to what the alternatives are. I believe that the issues in Mojave County are unique, and we need the ability to be able to address our issues. We are not in crisis yet, but we don't want to be in crisis. I think I take exception to the jump. If we delete the term voluntary, we're going to go to regulatory and we're going to regulate. Mojave County doesn't like regulations. I think you are hard-pressed to find a county more reluctant to regulate than Mojave. But what we need is the ability to measure, because how can we manage our water supply if we don't know what we're managing? We need data. We need measurements to know what it is that we need to manage. It may be, once they have the data, and Mojave County is maybe a bit ahead of some of the others because they have a study coming out with USGS that's due next summer, as I was advised yesterday, to help evaluate some of their issues. But Mojave wants the ability to measure. They haven't said they want to regulate. They want to measure. They want to know what's in their aquifers, what's being recharged, and what's being withdrawn. And I think it would be beneficial to the state as a whole if this stakeholder group had that discussion. I understand, and I'm going to acknowledge it may be the discussion is nothing more than a discussion in this room, but at least the issues will have seen the light of day. From a practical standpoint, we're in Arizona. We're looking at voluntary measures as being the most effective way we manage our resources. But I think we need to identify the issues.
And to that point, the Wilcox Basin asked for volunteers to measure their wells, and they received quite a bit. In fact, they received enough so the department could come up and address the non-expansion of irrigation district. The local newspaper put it in the paper. If you want your wells metered to assist the Department of Water Resources, please contact. And they've got, I don't know how many, but quite a few, because I got a copy of each application that was willing to have their wells metered. And so to ask voluntarily, keeping in mind that if there is a certain area that has a challenge and has a water challenge, the department is still in control and can determine that area to be an active management area. If the people in the area would like to have an active management area and go more regulations, they can vote one in, put it on the ballot, let the local people speak. Any other comments? Mr. Aha.
Bass Aha. I'm not a conqueror, but even though some of my ancestors from Spain and the Basque Country were, it didn't work out too well for them. Support these goals. I think that once we get into the planning areas and start looking at the data and that, I think discussions individually between whatever one it might be might arise. And I don't think that everything is foreclosed in those discussions. The question is not measuring. We're measuring. USGS is measured. DWR's got a great website. Got all kinds of data about, what's stored in aquifers, what's recharged in aquifers, what's the use that they have. I mean, there's a a lot of data there, and I suspect and hope that will come out as we look at through these various planning basins that are listed here, and that can inform us. What always seemed to escape is it's not a question of measuring, it's who's measuring and how are they measuring. And as I said, USGS is measuring. Mojave County's going to do a study they're going to measure. And so it's not like we're not measuring. We have been measuring. And I think as we go through those, a couple of those basins, it'll inform us. I support these goals.
Yes. Yes, this is Supervisor Irwin with La Paz County. I think I just want to make a comment. I hope that this whole group keeps into consideration whether you're representing, the major water users, which I do in La Paz County, along with the residents as well, because we do have major water users that have came into our area after generations have lived there for a very long time. And those residents now are being damaged because of the amount of water that is being pumped out. And so I'd just like everybody to keep in mind we need to all be able to exist, whether you're, have a business and you're utilizing water, but also keeping a conscious mind on the residents and people that are now experiencing their wells going dry or the water quality that's diminishing, which I'm seeing, on a weekly basis. I'm getting phone calls. So those are the real concerns I know that La Paz County has, and these aren't your mom and pop farms that are there anymore. These are just businesses that are entities that are from other areas that just keep pumping water out. And we tried the voluntary approach, and that didn't seem to go very far. And still we're stuck with the same situation. So I'm here on behalf of both, to be able to try to come up with solutions to where we all can exist. But for La Paz County, I know that we definitely need to get a handle on how much water's in those basins. Because as of right now, we have no clue. And in the meantime, the water just keeps flowing at a great rate. So I just wanted to throw those comments out.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Hi, this is Jen
Yes.
I'm sorry. This is Jen Myers, and
would you speak up, please?
Yes, speaking for Keenan, we have an agreement with the county, and it is true that we've done a further study with the USGS so that we can get a model of our aquifer, and the information and the modeling of the aquifer should be forthcoming in the spring. Also, information is coming that was legislatively required later this year. And I think that the legislature has set up for the Northwest Basin some committees to actually study this data. And what
we can't. We're having difficulty understanding. We've got a bad connection, I think.
Oh no, I'm on vacation. That's probably why. I would like to second Supervisor Irwin's comments and also Jamie Kelly's. I think we need to take the data that's going to be created, and I think it would be worthwhile to expand this dialogue and look at the various alternatives for the planning regions. We have had a tremendous influx of commercial agriculture, and the whole dynamic has changed in the county. So I would love to see the dialogue kind of aligned between the groups that we will have to help, so that we have shared information about what is actually happening in our region, and translate that to establish I won't go so far as rulemaking, but the recommendations for what needs to happen to conserve our water and protect our communities.
Okay, any other comments?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I just want to say to those,
Senator.
Thank you. To those who are on the phone, especially the last comment, I think you're speaking too close to the mic because it was so muffled that we couldn't understand. So perhaps if you move just a little bit distant, have a little more distance with the mic on your phone and speak a little more loudly, it may be beneficial. Thank you.
Okay, this is Jen Miles. Is this Patty?
Excuse me just a moment, Jen. Does she have the ability to email her questions or comments in?
I can do that.
They have you can use the text number.
Jen, you can just type in your comments onto the webinar screen there, just like you were earlier, and then I can relay those comments to the committee.
Thank you.
Ron, did you have another comment?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. Ron Doba from NAMWA. You know, I started the comments, and we kind of took off from there, and I'd just like to take the opportunity to clarify what I said with regards to voluntary alternatives in item 2B up there. I certainly don't have an issue with voluntary alternatives. I think they're fantastic when they work. I would just hope that when we're looking at possible resolutions to groundwater issues that we don't limit ourselves to voluntary alternatives.
And tell me, for the record, who you represent.
Northern Arizona Municipal Water Users Association, NAMWA.
And they are, could you name them?
They are cities and towns in the northern part of the state, Flagstaff, Cottonwood, Verde Valley cities, so forth.
Okay, thank you. Well, I might add, as far as best management practices, we all have them in our industries. I know the agriculture community has best management practices, specifically ranching and rotation of land use and ground cover. Contractors, right now, in most areas, subdivisions, you get water off of the lot as soon as you can. Well, if we calculated and quantified the amount of water coming off of a 2,000 square foot roof and use that water, those are the type of best management practices that I'm looking at. I was in a meeting several years ago with a hydrologist that said, we're losing 95% of the rains that we get, the water that we get. Everything that evaporates goes down hard surface roads and evaporates. And what would happen if we were able, through best management practices and everyone sitting around the table, to save another 5%? That particular hydrologist made comments that we wouldn't want it to do, but we would have enough water to export. But we would not want to do that, regardless if we have a lot of water or not so much water. It's a resource we don't want to waste. And so we're here, Senator and I are here, the legislature's here, not only to represent our districts, the industries in our districts and the residents in our districts, but we're also here for the state of Arizona. So if Phoenix has a problem, we want to address it. Other areas, water companies, we want to be there for you. But we don't want mandates in most of rural Arizona, except for very few areas that might want a mandate. And if the active management areas that are existing now had met their management plans, maybe we shouldn't address non-active management areas until their plans work. Many feeling in rural Arizona comments, but they don't want Big Brother. They don't want City of Phoenix or Maricopa County coming down and saying, you will do this, you will do that. Go out to the people. Talk to the residents. Get them to vote on putting meters on their wells. Get them to, include them in the discussion rather than top down. But there's a lot of best management practices that I'm sure we feel we're doing more in non-active management areas than those that are in an active management areas. Some of you have been out to my my property, and at the time I was a realtor that could afford to do those things, but I don't want to drop a water leaving my land, and I've gone to the expense, and I have all the wildlife. I probably have more hummingbirds than you do on my property because I'm conscientious, and I want clean air, clean water, and I want to get along with all my neighbors, and I want to do it right. But many of my neighbors don't know how to do it, and that's where the best management practices come in. Like I said, that the NRCD's Natural Resource Conservation Districts are doing some magnificent things that we need to highlight, and they come in on a voluntary basis, and they show the city homeowner as far as and businesses and large landowners how they can better use and manage the waters that they have access to. So those are the type of things that I'd like to compile. So if each one of you have best management practices that you use, that you recommend, please submit them to the committee so that we can compile those and educate the public how they can better manage the water in their areas.
Representative Griffin.
Yes.
How are we going to act as a committee? In other words, we've had great discussions on agenda item 2, B, and C. How are we going to decide whether or not we modify those 2 items or whether we use them for the committee goals and objectives?
Well, let me jump in too. I would like to see the way they are, to see if they work, and then if they don't work, add to them and make recommendations.
Will the chair entertain a motion? I move that we accept B and C as stated.
Thank you. Motion made. All those in favor, signify by saying aye. All those opposed, nay.
Nay.
The ayes carried. Thank you. Okay, number 2.
Well, wait. I don't know that we had a second to the motion, and I don't know how that the ayes carried over the nays, because I would call for a revote on that by way of hands. I don't think we foreclosed the discussion. What you were going to say, Smith?
Well, I was also going to say, it's obvious that we don't have consensus. So this is a derivative of the council, so we'll report the substance of this conversation, this discussion, to the council, and we can take a vote today, and that can be reported, and it can inform the council's endeavors.
Well, the point is, Clint, we need to act. This committee is going to be acting and doing things. If we don't have objectives and goals that we can rely upon to go forward on, then we're just kind of generally going around saying, well, let's talk about this and that. I think that the goals and objectives do have a purpose in helping to define, not rigidly, not strictly, what we're going to be looking at. And therefore, I think we need to take some action in some way or another on various items because, frankly, as this evolves for the next 10 or 15 years, we're not going to agree on many things. And if we are precluded from arriving at some action because we can't all agree on it, then we're kind of stopped at the beginning.
Maybe that's a choice eventually for the council. We also have, to a certain extent, an existential issue. So the members of the council are appointed by the governor. The Director Bishotsky, has, along with the governor's office, rendered the choice that anybody who desires to participate in this committee may do so. So anybody comes to the door. So do we throw open a vote for everybody in the room, or how do we proceed? I mean, I guess we'd have some sort of a discussion on that, but do we just simply take a vote of spaces that we have here at the table, or do we just report back to the council that we don't have consensus on this?
What we do on A.
Well, and how many of us around the table are representing active management areas. Anybody here? Non-AMAs? Both? Okay.
Clint,
so
DWR have a position on the goals?
We're not going to place the finger on the scales regarding the goals today. I can indicate that we will report this to the council, this discussion, and inform the council's work.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since this has overtones of like a legislative procedure, under Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure, committees are designed for discussion. And motions usually that preclude future discussion or taking items off the table are generally out of order. That is made for more of the governing body to decide what they want to do. Since we're all here to discuss potential options, even if you may not agree with pulling away from what the stated goals are, I still think it'd be appropriate to leave those on the table so people can bring them up in future discussion if that's warranted and appropriate.
I don't think there's going to be anything excluded from discussion for this committee in the future. Yeah, period. Yeah. Yes.
Doug Dunn, Epcor Water. Maybe in hopes of helping Mr. Noble move his motion forward, perhaps if we could clarify B a little bit, that I think we're spinning around the axle on the definition, recognizing the state Supreme Court's decision that groundwater in and of itself is not necessarily a property right, but recognizing that folks do have the right to use their properties. They are currently engaged in use of the aquifer for beneficial use. And I don't think that anybody in the room here would support a communist-type takeover to swoop in and stop current uses, et cetera. So maybe to clarify that private property rights include land use, but not necessarily excludes the regulation of groundwater to some extent, and if such areas warrant that, and maybe we can move forward with that for the committee's consideration.
I wouldn't agree to that. Surprise. Yes.
Chris Custis, EDF, Water for Arizona Coalition. So continuing on Doug's comment, just trying to think of ways to help Mr. Noble's motion. What I'm hearing is, so I think B, I think as it stands by itself, I think is a fine goal, but what I'm hearing around the table is the idea and hope that this group could be a forum where ideas could come forth, whether that's from Mojave County, La Paz County, or Northern Arizona, and perhaps those ideas don't fit within a singular classification, that could still happen moving forward. So if there's a way to incorporate that sort of additional language into the goals, whether it's point D or added on to point B, perhaps that might help. But the idea being ideas can come forward from local places, whether they're voluntary or something else, and we would still be willing to discuss and debate those ideas.
Do you want to amend your motion to include a D that would allow further discussion of all issues?
Certainly. However, I'm tempted to withdraw the motion and let the chair act on their prerogative and tell us what they're going to be. Anyway, yes, I would amend the motion.
Okay, so we have a D that will allow the committee, not allow, but have further discussion on other issues that may be brought forward for discussion purposes. Okay. All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. Okay, we have a D. All right. The plan number 2, topics. And again, going back to the goals and best management practices, I would ask that all of you, I learn from others. I'm not in the agriculture business, the farming or ranching, or I'm not in the construction business. I was once a time, I was, but I learn from what you are doing. I know the water companies are doing things as well. So please bring to the table best management practices, and I know the Nature Conservancy has a box load of good ideas. And then we can further discuss those and how we can move forward. Thank you. Okay, 2 is topics. The different basins that we have listed. When the department, Clint, maybe you can, did everybody get a copy of the different water basins?
That's going down now.
That's going down now.
Okay, I think there were one out front when we walked in. Certain things, and again, one size does not fit all. I don't know about many of these basins, but I will by the end of the studies, I'm sure. But in each one of these basins, we have federal property, state trust property, military, tribal. When we do these studies, is there a way that we can identify how much private property that we have and how we can work with the other entities to either identify what they're doing for water conservation and how we might be able to work with them to create some kind of water conservation measures on their properties as well. I know that the tribes are doing a great job. Questionable whether or not Forest Service, if we had forest management, and that's a topic later on the agenda, but the San Pedro has no control on what happens in Mexico, and how does that affect the area, in the study, and there's certain things in certain areas that we probably need to look at. Any other questions on the basins?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Am I correct in that there's 4 basins missing? Didn't have adequate data?
Which ones are they?
That's my question.
There should be 22.
There's 18 on the agenda list, but I think there's 22 planning areas.
That's correct. The ones that are missing are the AMAs and the Colorado River main and main stem north and south.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, and are they? We probably should consider what they're doing as well, or at least have the access to that information.
The Colorado River, the main stem north and south, probably ought to be left alone because it's federal.
Yeah, okay.
It's just different.
Okay.
On this one, though, we talked about I think it's under A, is this one where we want to start with DWR providing some base information for the next meeting? And do we want to start with, did it come out of the strategic vision? What was the document you did?
Strategic vision.
Do we want to start with the basin summaries from the strategic vision as a starting place too, because it has the population information? It's been updated or needs to be?
Well, we've been progressing through a planning area process, and we've attended to the Northwest Basins, West Basins, Cochise, presently in Gila Bend. I think it would be, if we were to include this desirable to know the pleasure of the committee on what you want to see out of it. A lot of what we receive is provided indirectly. It's their estimates. I mean, I really appreciate Bass's confidence in us about all the reporting that is received by the department, and we do have index wells, we have well sweeps, but there's still big gaps out there. We have supply and demand analyses that we've been performing through this planning area process, but we don't have a lot of direct data, so there are limitations. If we know what you want to see out of this, then we could adjust to that, and we could, to the extent that we can. And we're certainly willing to provide a broad brush presentation on status of groundwater as a state, but I think it would help to better refine what the committee's desires are for this item or this context.
One of the things that is in that strategic vision is the amount of private land versus public land, the data that you were just asking for, Gail.
Good. Yes.
A question for Clint. We had a kind of a long conversation this morning about voluntary versus mandatory when it comes to well reporting. Every piece of legislation that I've seen over my time since '98 forward when it comes to wells outside of active management areas, which are not exempt wells, has been a mandatory effort to either cap the gallonage pumped, meters put on, reporting. It hasn't been one that was voluntary. There was no incentives. There was nothing along those lines that I've seen come forward to the legislature. I'm spending a great deal of time, not as much as others out in rural Arizona, talking to folks about coming on their property and telling them that they got to pay for a well or a meter, and then they got to report to big government. Doesn't go over real well. So I don't know if there's been any conversation about providing incentives, sharing of data with those property owners versus coming in kind of heavy-handed, top-down. And with all due respect to the co-chair, Jamie Kelly, Mojave was one of those entities that came down to the legislature, at least our elected officials did, in support of mandatory restrictions. And as we've all recently seen through DCP, we're reminded of the saying, you know, water's for fighting. We know the rest. And if I'm trying to stay away from it. If we keep focused, I think that we can come up with some ideas. And I know that this is a long explanation to you, Clint, but has there ever been anything that has come forward in order to get the information, not only a kind of a voluntary outreach effort, but anything on the incentive front to say, hey, property owners, there's a lot of interest in what's going on in this basin, whether it's big water users coming in and residents being impacted by that. Has there been any conversation along those lines? Because we seem to have two approaches, voluntary versus the heavy-handed approach. Mm-hmm. And I lay that open and see if you have any information on that.
Well, perhaps there's a middle ground, and an ever-been question can be a little bit tough. It's hard to know how far back do you go, and certainly there have been proposals that predate my experience here. But we do have voluntary cooperative efforts with well owners throughout the state, and that's part of our well sweep program, where our hydrology staff, our field services staff will go out and they'll have that engagement and collect that data. And that does have considerable utility for the department. As far as incentives, I'm not aware of anything specific. That doesn't mean it hasn't existed in the somewhat recent past, but I do know that we do encourage those voluntary efforts, and that does inform our work here. As far as compulsory or something that's perceived as heavy-handed, that was something that was amply discussed during the governor's water solutions conversation, and there was a spectrum of possibilities identified at the time, and some were as simple as just looking at a utility bill, and you can, from that, don't ask me how today, but you can extrapolate what the water usage is and just report it that way. You don't have to have somebody with a clipboard accessing the property or jumping over somebody's fence or trying to get around a locked gate. You can just ask folks to mail in a postcard with the water use information. So that was something that entered the conversation at the time, just so we would have the data that would better enable our work here.
Sandy.
Tom, in answer to your question too, and I think for everybody is to go back and revisit, what was that thing called before we did the strategic vision? It was the water, where we did all the projections and everybody came together. It was after the Blue Ribbon, WRDC. So there was a lot of discussion about different options, some voluntary, some incentive. That has a ton of information in it as related to that. So I think that it might be good reading if you're really bored, but it
sounds like late light reading.
Yeah, but there's some good information in there. It should be on DWR's website.
It is. Okay. It's available.
It's there.
Okay.
Okay. Any other comments?
I've been to too many to remember.
Madam Chair.
Yes. For the record.
For the record, Doug Dunham, EPCOR. Again, Tom, there have been several discussions on perhaps some tax incentives for the offset the cost of metering, and that was actually part of the groundwater code. So when that came into force in the AMAs, and most of the volunteering that has been gone on out there has been for DWR to capture water level measurements, not actual daily use type measurements. So there is requirements for municipal type providers like EPCOR to report under the outside the AMAs, and so that captures a lot of the municipal type uses. Then the other industrial types, agricultural uses, there's really no capturing of that at the moment.
Any other comments?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Ron Dobin, AMWA. When I look at these various planning areas, one of the things that comes to my mind is what are the groundwater issues of concern? Because they're likely going to be different in the various planning areas throughout the state. And it would be nice if we knew, for example, when we look at the Central Plateau or the Verde, what are the groundwater issues that they are concerned with right now? What's on the top of their list? They're going to be different than what we have in the southern part of the state, likely. But it would be nice to see those compiled somehow to give us some help in the direction we should go as a committee.
Again, one size doesn't fit all. Yeah, that would address it. Yeah. Any other comments?
Madam Chair, is this a good time to read the comment that someone had on the phone?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Jen Miles wrote that the City of Kingman has partnered with Mojave County to expand the USGS study and create a model of the Hualapai Basin aquifer. The data coming in from this study and from Mojave County through the study required by the legislature needs to be reviewed as part of this process prior to making recommendations for actions that need to be taken. The alternatives need to be reviewed beyond voluntary compliance. I do not agree with goals B and C as they are too confining on potential outcomes. The rapid promulgation of commercial agriculture in the past 7 years in Mojave makes it imperative that we consider appropriate alternatives to conserve water and protect our communities. She supports the comments made by Holly Irwin and Jamie Kelly.
Thank you. And I think we covered that by D, adding D to it. Any other comments?
Could you please repeat D?
D.
Further discussion of issues that may be brought forward.
Okay, any other questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to B, to quantify the number of non-exempt and exempt wells by planning area. I think the department has that information. Does it need to be updated as to, does it include intent to drill? Does it include wells that have not been drilled? Or just based on actually drilled wells?
No, we can look at that.
So that information is available, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. And then updating, I understand you're updating the ownership of those wells as well. They're continually working on that.
Continual process.
Yes.
A lot of data cleanup with that.
Yeah,
No.
okay. All right, C, well monitoring and measurements. And as by voluntary means, Wilcox did this with the department, and they were able to do their well sweeps and information in that particular area because the people wanted the information known. Those that did not volunteer. And the natural and constructed methods to assess groundwater, the natural recharge from streams and springs coming in the mountains, mountain front recharge. Do you look at that and do you add that to the water budget in the certain areas, planning areas? Or do you just do the pumping measurements? When you have a bank account, whether it be your own or whether it be your water bank account, if you just count the withdrawals and don't count the deposits, it's not a balanced figure. So do you take any of that into consideration?
We do.
You do. How do you quantify that amount?
Well, as best we can. With, we have different claims that we use, but I mean it's not completely precise, but we use the best. Sorry about that. Yeah, we do account for that to the extent that we can. It's not completely precise, but basically every source that we can use to bring those numbers in. Okay, and maybe we can, again, going back to the best management practices, if you have a subdivision and you have, there are subdivisions that have guttering around the houses and they actually have areas where that water goes in and recharges. Maybe we can help with that as well. But the horseshoe draw, for instance, they are quantifying the amount of recharge on that particular project. So when we take a look at the areas, what can we do, or the counties or the cities, or what all can be done to help balance that checkbook with not only withdrawals but deposits as well? And I'll be happy to help you work on that. Well, thank you.
I'm sure everybody at the table will be as well. Correct.
Yeah. Madam Chair, in a former life, I used to be a groundwater modeler for the department, and one of the things to help kind of complete Clint's answer is the process of doing groundwater modeling. So we would calculate the inflows from mountain front recharge based on modeling at the regional scale. So that was one of the kind of the boundaries or the tools that are used to help understand mountain front recharge.
That's great. As long as we're basing it on some kind of fair scientific data, we're in good shape. Okay. Any other comments? Stephanie?
Stephanie Smallhouse, Arizona Farm Bureau. This is a question for Clint, I think, but building upon Mr. Hill's comment, do you think we could have a presentation if we're going to be getting information in, but maybe, hopefully it wouldn't be just beneficial to me, but do you think we could have a presentation of how that is done and what exactly are those things that the department is using to collect, what measurements, are using for the recharge? I don't know, maybe that would only be beneficial to me, and then maybe I can just...
No, I think that would be beneficial to all of this.
Okay. And then my question to Clint is, does the department use, I recently was given some information about the GRACE program with NASA. Does the department use any of that information in terms of their program, which can actually tell you what the levels of groundwater are in the basin?
Not that I'm aware of. Our hydrology department is utilizing that, and I've read reports on that, and it seems like very intriguing methodology, but I'm not sure if our hydrology department uses that or not.
Okay. Yes, Bill.
Yes, Madam Chair. Bill Garfield, Arizona Water Company. It might be helpful to know which of these areas actually have any kind of modeling done at all, in some kind of a summary or table form, whether it was a numerical calibrated groundwater model or whether it was just a water budget that was conducted at some point in the past. I'm assuming that exists to one degree or another. Some areas are very heavily probably studied and recently, and some probably not to a great extent. So it might be good as a base level of understanding to know which ones have good information and which ones do not.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay. Any other comments? Yes.
Yeah, Don Bills, Cocaine Plateau Water Partnership. Just to follow up on Stephanie's comment about the GRACE data, the methodology actually measures gravity changes over an Earth's surface to look at a mass change over time for that surface. So you're actually measuring the mass or volume of groundwater that's moving into and out of a basin. The USGS has done a number of studies using gravity and microgravity, particularly for basins in the central and southern part of Arizona, but also for some of the smaller basins up in northern Arizona. So that's a particularly useful way to assess recharge and groundwater use over time. The problem is the information is typically relates to longer time scales, years or decadal changes, and in a lot of cases, most water users, particularly in rural parts of the state, are trying to address changes that are happening right now, seasonally or annually. So when you talk about monitoring and measuring, you need to consider the fact that you have to have a network that can address those issues on shorter time scales and cover an area with sufficient number of data points to actually begin to evaluate where and how the changes are occurring.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie.
Let me just start my question, or my response to that. So then what you're saying then is that perhaps the department doesn't have long-term data, something that would show a change over time. Mostly what we have is modeling and pinpoint data. And so I guess my question is, how far do we go through the planning process for information that could be fluctuating greatly that we really have no idea for, depending on the area?
Well, I guess my response to that is that the department does have long-term data. They've got a very good observation network throughout the state, but in some parts of the state, particularly rural parts of the state, the data points that they're using are very broadly spread over those rural areas and may not capture change that may be occurring that relate to problems that are developing in some of the rural areas.
Any other comments, Clint? No?
I think it would be helpful to have a presentation from our hydrology department. And we do keep that intertemporal data so you can see how the changes occur over time. And I've seen quite a few of those. Probably don't want me to be the guy explaining it all to you. So I think it would be good to have either Jeff Inwood or one of the others from our hydrology section to present on if it's the pleasure of the chairs to have that discussion at a future meeting.
I think it would be, and I think it would be helpful to do it at perhaps the next meeting so that we have that knowledge to move forward with.
Yeah, we can do that.
Sandy.
Clint, I think also in that presentation, it might be really helpful for the hydrology group to not only get that presentation, but also sort of just run through what's available, all the information and tools that are available online. Because a lot of the information that folks are talking about is really, it's all there. It's just finding a way to get to it. If you're not used to the website, I think that might be really helpful because there's a lot of useful information in the department or on the department's website. And going back to some of those even previous studies, WRDC for what it was, the strategic vision itself has a lot of that water balance information, albeit somewhat out of date, but at least it'll give a pretty good overview of each of the areas, the information that was available in those areas, the demands at the time, population trends, wells, all that stuff. So there's a lot of information out there. I think we're just going to have to each do our own, a little bit of homework so you're prepared for this.
Any other comments? Thank you. Okay, D is forest management, benefits to watershed management. I think all of us want better forest management rather than the fires. Our national forests were not meant for parks. They were meant for economies and water. And there are some good things that are happening in the forest management line. And we can create more wet water if we manage them correctly. Any comments on that?
Well, I just watched on the news last night that the areas near Flagstaff, which had been thinned with the Watershed Protection Project, have slowed the fire on Mount Eldon, and it's gone to the ground. And the areas where it hasn't been thinned, it's having that crowning activity. It's taking off. So
build up fuel.
And to that point, Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator.
Yeah, I just returned from Flagstaff yesterday, so place of my childhood and means a lot to me. So, our hearts are with everybody in Flagstaff. But I do also know that there was, they were in the process of getting ready to remove a lot of the vegetation and some of the logging that are now acting as fuel. So, when discussing forage management, the logistics of getting the material off of the ground, as well as potential business opportunities, we know that California is in need of building materials. So there's a real potential for money to be made in Arizona, and I think it's something that we need to encourage when looking at forest management and the logistics of getting this off of the mountain, as well as near Cragen and some of our extremely important watersheds. So.
Yes, Sandy.
I think this is another area where it might be good to get some information from folks like SRP who are doing work, the Nature Conservancy, and others who are doing work in this area. I think it might be another really good place or presentation to provide to the group. So I'm not really sure what we're supposed to do with this. We all want it, but what are we going to do? And I think getting to that point where it's, identifying specific actions that are being taken today that might be expanded on, that sort of thing might be good thing to do.
And to that point, the available monies made from FORFRI in the form of grants that are now available. I know SRP is looking at it, AMWI, I believe, is looking at it too, but putting all of our minds together and seeing how some of those grants can best be used with the FORFRI project would be very beneficial.
Economies and water. Yes.
Chuck Podolak with SRP. We're happy to. I think Sandy makes a good point that
happy to participate in educational briefing on it, but I think I'd also echo Sandy's point on how hugely important issue and something that's been at the forefront of SRP's thinking on water for a long time. But how does that relate to what we're trying to do here? And to Wade's point about the goals driving this organization, I think we should talk about forest management, but to what end and how does that integrate with the goals that the coaches are setting? If you want to go there, great, but I think we should be clear in how we want to integrate that into our groundwater discussion.
Maybe how we can partner with others to create a healthy environment and better forest management. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments? E, phreatophytes and invasive species management. We had a couple bills this year referencing removal of salt cedar. I know the study in the Sandpaper, there are over 50% of the water use in the Sandpaper was the phreatophytes. And if we can thin and make a healthy environment in all of these watersheds, we should be looking at that. Any other comments? Okay. F.
Madam Chair, I'd go ahead and offer a comment there. I think that there's definitely places where it's appropriate to do that. There's some existing research going on right now to try to help quantify the benefits from that, which I think would be instructive. I don't know the time frame will be how useful it will be, for the committee right now, but I think trying to identify those places where these kinds of targeted interventions can help solve groundwater problems, I think, can be important.
Good. Thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
Madam Chair, I would like to find out, too, if there's data out there that does show that this is a problem in all of the 22 planning areas, or just where the real, I assume it is.
Okay.
But I guess those that focus on the groundwater.
Okay, Madam Co-Chair.
I guess the information that, in reviewing the literature, a lot of the vegetation management in more arid areas is very difficult because of the nature of our precipitation here to be able to really be able to pinpoint it. It's mostly along water courses or when you get up into higher elevations where you're trying to deal with snow melt that you're going to get most of your benefit from vegetation management. So it's just very, very difficult to quantify any kind of benefits, and just because of the arid nature and the typically the way our precipitation comes, it's so spotty that are very hard to quantify.
Okay.
Yes, Madam.
To that point, somebody on the line. Yes.
Yes, this is Tina. Thank you. I just wanted to comment that Buckeye had studied a stretch out in our area that is probably one of the most, choked off areas of the state, many of rivers, and their study found that we could recoup approximately 50,000 feet of water annually. So it will, take time. Someone made that comment that it needs to be a priority for our future water needs.
To that point, Madam Chair?
To that point, we appropriated, I think, $12 million, $2 million this year and $1 million each following year for this purpose. Senator.
Thank you. I share areas of Buckeye with Senator Kerr, who was just on the phone, but in looking at areas that can be affected by the invasive species, we also can't forget that in Buckeye is a Superfund site, and when there is flooding, there is the potential danger of damaging that site, which means that would spill into the groundwater and then affect potentially the beautiful farmlands going all the way down to Yuma, my area. So I think in looking at these areas, it's not only the highlands, but it's also areas that may have other areas of potential disaster, such as the Superfund site, where it could be flooded and damage that property and affect our economy and agriculture as well.
Okay. And Stephanie, yes.
Madam Co-Chair, I would just like to add on to what Pat said about I mean, it is very complicated to quantify some of that. Some of it I think is not, but I don't think we can have a discussion about groundwater use without discussing how much the vegetation is using, especially if it's invasive, and along these, like you were saying, mostly along these valley bottoms and riverways. So I think any legitimate discussion about groundwater planning, whether it's voluntary, whether we're talking about voluntary stuff or mandatory or whatever, or wherever this goes, we have to discuss the water use of vegetation in some of these areas, which are monolithic in terms of the vegetation and quite a bit of water. So,
good comments. Okay, F. I'm looking at my watch, and it's 11:21, and we're supposed to be out of here by 11:30. F is educating the general public and groundwater users and incentives for documented groundwater pumping reductions.
Madam Co-Chair? Perhaps we expand this or revise it to address Mr. Farley's suggestion about incentives to report.
Yes.
Certainly have no issue with the incentives. I'm a little confused by documenting groundwater pumping reduction because we're talking about outside of AMAs, and I'm not aware of folks having certificated water rights out there that they would become comfortable saying, okay, you have recognized my 100 acre-feet of water right. I'm going to go into a process where I'm going to try to only use 90, and then 10 of it I will document to show you I reduced it. If you're a well owner and you have no recognition by the state of having a water right, I think it'd be pretty hard to get people to step forward and say, I want you to document your reduction of something that I don't even recognize.
That the state doesn't recognize.
Yeah, the state.
Chair.
Yes.
Chuck Podolak with SRP. I think in F would be a great place to put in addition to Stephanie's point about the adjudication, and that we, the surface water users throughout the state understand there is a connection between water that comes out of a well and surface water. And I think making it, if we have an education function, I think this would be a great place to clarify that and to help inform people that there is that connection and what is the current state in the court on those connections. And at the educational level, I think it would be a good place to put that.
I don't think that, I think that 90% of the people in Arizona have no idea that there's even an adjudication going on, and much less what subflow is versus surface flow. I definitely think there's some merit to providing that education, but I also have to agree with Bass in the fact that you're never going to incentivize people enough to report what they're using unless you give them some kind of security that you're not going to take it away, and or tax it for that matter. That's a whole different issue in terms of withdrawal fees and things. But for sure, unless there's some kind of effort within the state to go to those well owners and say, you've been using this water for so long and you've put it to beneficial use, as Doug said earlier, and we are going to certify that as something that matters in whatever that's called. There's just, it's a no-starter.
Sandy.
This is a particularly difficult area given the outstanding nature of the adjudication. I do believe that it's a good place to help educate the many folks that are part of it yet don't know they're part of it, and how that might implicate or, or label their groundwater as something else, and I think that's an important thing. I think the difficulty in all of it is if you're trying to get people to reduce their use, it's counter to what, our surface water laws allow for. And so it might be a really, I hate to say this, but this might be a really good area for that interconnect of the two sources and how we address, and particularly perhaps how we address some of the existing laws that drive use it or lose it, yet impact your ability to maintain groundwater pumping in long term. And I go back to the, I hate to say it because I know somebody's going to everybody's always mad at me, so I'm just going to say, so it goes back to the forfeiture issue, and maybe this might be an arena where we can have that conversation and find a bridge for a long-term solution, or a temporary solution that is long-term to get us through that. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but this might be an area of that conversation, to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I don't think this has to turn into the adjudication. We don't have to solve subflow and groundwater, surface water, but I think at least at the educational level and being open to see if there's groundwater issues that are on that margin between the two that the committee could tackle.
Madam Chair. I guess I would just comment that it is extremely complicated, but I don't know how we can, we can't ignore the fact that a lot of agriculture is going on in these subflow zones. And if we're looking at our 18 planning areas, and maybe that's something we can do as we move through this process and we go through, I think at a minimum, that should be identified with some of those planning areas as something that prohibits further planning. I just don't see how you can go down this road and looking at all of these different areas, especially when you have areas that are involved in the adjudication. Doesn't make sense to me. So.
Okay, G, recharge methods, stormwater runoff and reuse. I spent Saturday in Mount Lemmon. That's 9,000 feet up, and that community was burned down a couple times. And they're rebuilding. I have not seen as much traffic. Everybody from Tucson going up to Mount Lemmon to get out of the heat. They have a great community. They use their runoff and reuse and snow melt. And they're doing a lot of good things with a lot more to come. Effluent is treated effluent, being able to calculate that. Other conservation measures and projects. Touring some of the branches, maybe, and all the good things that are happening. So I want to hear about all the good projects that are in the works and how we can duplicate them. I know we are redoing the study on state land, state trust land, to identify parcels for recharge and maybe something similar to the Horseshoe Draw project. So things that we can do, conservation, recharge. At one particular point in time, they were talking about spacing of wells. I don't know that that's a good idea anymore, a cost or what have you. Diversion and recharge, stormwater recharge, floodwaters, taking advantage of them instead of it evaporating, and water importation, desal, and other things that we're talking about in the Water Council. Any other comments under G, recharge methods? Okay, and it is 11:30. So the transfer basins, Harklahala, Butler, and McMullen. I know we're having a House committee on Harklahala next month, and the reasons these three basins were set up when they were, and the purpose. Did we get a map? We were going to have a map of those areas. Did we do that?
I don't know that we got that one.
So maybe we can have that one for.
Basically, the West.
They should be on the strategic.
Yeah.
So the West Basins.
The
West Basins. Okay.
We can email that out.
Yeah, we can break that out. Okay, next, any other closing comments? Senator.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick addition, if we could, to D. What we had written was further discussion, and I would just like to say, and recommendations. If we could add recommendations to D in case they come up, we'll be still within those parameters. And that was on 2D.
2D?
Yeah, 2D under the defined goals, just to add and recommendations. I said further discussion. I believe the language was, further discussion of, I can't read your writing. Discussion of issues that may be brought forward. And if we could say discussion and recommendations.
I have a map of the transportation basin.
Okay.
I think the further discussions will cover that. You know, we can make the recommendations at the time. I don't think that changes D at all.
Madam Chair, I'm reading text from people that are just writing me, so I read out loud what I hear from my constituents.
I don't see a harm in it. It's not a harm to put in.
Anybody have feelings? All those in favor, signify. All those opposed? Identify the no's. There's no's in there as well. Okay, 11:33. We're over time. It's obvious we're going to have further meetings. Anybody want to make any closing comments? I don't see any. So with that, we'll get our dates together and we'll notify you the next meeting. We'll send it out to everybody. We have public comment.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to say I agree with, I'm so glad that you guys added D to that, and thank you again, Senator Rotundo, for doing that addition to it with referrals. I did agree with Ms. Kelly's, Chairman Kelly's comments, as well as Supervisor Irwin's comments. For the record, I'm Representative Cobbin, sorry. I did say that at the beginning. I represent District 5, which is La Paz and Mojave County. Goal D does cover other issues, and I'm glad for the recommendations, but I also saw that it is Goal D, or Goal C was also reinforced in one of the items as voluntary also. So I did think that that was limited. I'm glad we expanded that to D, so thank you for doing that. Chairman Griffin had also mentioned that there was an area that any area could go into an AMA, and I think that means that we can do all or nothing. You either go to an AMA or you don't do anything. There's zero in between. I think the study committee that we have coming up is kind of addressing those issues also. So hopefully we could do that during our La Paz and our Mojave County study committees on HB 2467 that I had passed last year. and we can bring some recommendations forward to that. Also, the gentleman from Flagstaff that said that he would like to do some his own governing. We had talked about doing rural management areas where each area was different, and Chairman Griffin had mentioned that before about one size doesn't fit all, and I agree with that, and we'll be addressing those issues too, as far as each county has its own issues, and especially with the Harquahela coming up and that issue, we're going to be including those into our study committees also. So thank you.
Thank you. I did want to introduce Frank Krentz. Frank, are you still here? Would you stand? He's the president of the NRCDs for Arizona, and he probably would like to join our committee. So thank you for coming all the way down from Douglas. Appreciate you being here. Thank you. Any other public comments?
Excuse me?
Yes.
I just wanted to introduce myself to everyone. I'm Karen Modesto with the Department of Water Resources, and I'm helping coordinate this group. Please feel free to contact me if you have any information requests or you need help finding anything on our website. Want to look at it.
Anybody have any comments on that's on the phone? Hearing none. Meeting adjourned. Thank you all for being here.